Almost Erev Shabbat. Tomorrow is the fast day of Asar B'Tevet, and I wanted to talk a little bit about some halacha connected to Jewish history, hopefully lending to an inspiring end. But I wanted to frame our discussion in the following way, to give you a framework of exactly how we're going to play out the shir. I want to share the question that I don't plan to answer, but to try and analyze, which is, now that Baruch Hashem, we have the special zechut to be able to see a vaccine for the coronavirus on the horizon. The question is that there is always a Jewish element and reaction and thought behind what happens in the life cycle of the Jew on a religious standpoint, right? When certain things happen in our life cycle, we have religious commemorations. One of the most famous religious commemorations is, of course, the blessing, the bracha of Shechianu. Shechianu, right? Exactly. So the bracha of Shechianu, and the question that I'd like to deal with is, does one say Shechianu on the vaccine? Think about the words mean. Shechianu v'kiyimanu, right? Blessed are you, God, that you have given us life, Shechianu from the word chayim. V'kiyimanu, you've established us, kept us sustained. V'kiyanu, and let us arrive, to this special time, right? We made it through this far. I got what's that picture of my parents getting the vaccine the other night in Israel. Very exciting. Makes me a lot better. And so the question is raised about saying Shechianu on the vaccine. On the reception, if you receive the vaccine, does one say Shechianu? What I'd like to analyze this and not really get into it. We'll get you'll make your own conclusions at the end. But there was a similar debate that was a lot more drawn out because there was more time to deal with it, about a different huge cataclysmic event, the establishment of the State of Israel, and a massive debate about the recitation of Shechianu. And I'd like to share a couple of ideas and suggestions about that, and then perhaps extrapolate, right? Because we have a lot more debate about that. A recent contemporary cataclysmic event, the establishment of the State of Israel, a discussion about Shechianu then. If you're supposed to say Shechianu then, perhaps that may be applicable to recite Shechianu or some on the receiving of the vaccine. So I'd like to start with the opinion of 4 different Zionist rabbis, and I'm specifically focusing on one side of the debate, people who are starting with the axiom of the miracle and the celebration and the excitement of the establishment of the State of Israel. So we're going to focus on the Zionist rabbi's perspective. Obviously, there's a bigger debate, which we won't get into, about a variety of other perspectives. But I wanted to start, and hopefully this works, I want to start with a video clip. And it's a video clip that you may remember or recognize. It's of David Ben-Gurion in 1948 reading the Israeli Megillat HaAtzmaut. Okay? So let's take a look at this. Hopefully this shall work. And hopefully you'll still be able to hear me while the video goes on. Okay, let's see if this works. Here we go. Here's David Ben-Gurion.
בארץ ישראל קם העם היהודי.
Right, David Ben-Gurion reciting.
בה עוצבה דמותו הרוחנית, הדתית והמדינית. בה חי חיי קוממיות ממלכתית. בה יצר נכסי תרבות לאומיים וכלל אנושיים. והוריש לעולם כולו.
Okay, so here's David Ben-Gurion.
לאחר שוב מדינת ישראל
Jewish nation
תהי מוכנה
shall be prepared
לשתף פעולה
to join
עם
together with
המוסדות והנציגים של האומות המאוחדות בהגשמת החלטת העצרת יום 29 בנובמבר 1927 ותפעל להקמת האחדות הכלכלית של ארץ ישראל בשלמותה. ישראל לתוך משפחת העמים. אנו קוראים גם בתוך הפצצת הדמים הנערכת עלינו וחדשים. סוד נציגות מקצועית. וימיהם וקוראים להם במאמץ משותף לקדמת המזרח התיכון כולו. אנו קוראים אל העם היהודי בכל התפוצות להתלכד סביב היישוב בעלייה ובבניין ולעמוד לימינו במערכה הגדולת הדורות. מתוך ביטחון בצור ישראל הננו חותמים בחתימת ידינו לעדות על הכרזה זו במושב מועצת המדינה הזמנית על אדמת המולדת עיר תל אביב היום הזה ערב שבת אייר תש"ח 14 במאי 1948 לקבל את מגילת היסוד למדינת היהודים במידה. ברוך אתה אדוני אלוהינו מלך העולם שהחיינו וקיימנו והגענו לזמן הזה.
Did you hear that? Hopefully you could. At the reading and the announcement of the Israeli Declaration of Independence, Ben-Gurion reads through the whole thing and he ends with there's a famous discussion. He doesn't say, sorry, 1 second. Sorry about that. Not sure what happened there. So there he said, Bitoch Biton Bitsur Yisrael. They didn't want to say God's name. The non-religious and the religious were arguing fine. And they then said, Shechianu. But if you notice, it was a different voice saying Shechianu in the recitation of the Megillat HaAtzmaut. That voice was a rabbi by the name of Rabbi Yehuda Maimon. Now you might say somebody named Rabbi Yehuda Maimon. That sounds like a Sephardi rabbi. It's actually, his name was Rabbi Yehuda Leib, and his original name was Fishman. Rabbi Yehuda Leib Fishman. But he changed his name to Maimon once he was in his, also one of the great signatories of the Israeli Megillat HaAtzmaut, the Declaration of the Independence on the 5th of Iyar of 1948. And as soon as Ben-Gurion finishes, Maimon gives him a look. And Ben-Gurion says, all right, everyone please rise. We're going to accept this Ba'amidah in a rising. We just heard the video. And then from the wings, in a loud booming voice, it didn't sound so boring because he wasn't right at the microphone, in a loud booming voice, Maimon, who is a significant rabbinic figure we'll talk about in a moment, screams out the bracha of Shechianu. And everybody in the hall resoundingly says, Amen. This ended up being a really interesting debate. So I want to share with you, this is a picture of Rabbi Maimon. Let me see if I can get it here. Let's see here. Okay. And I want to share with you what he wrote when there was questions. Hey, right, let's talk about the question here. A bracha is not a benign thing. Bracha requires saying the name of God, which we know as part of the 10 Commandments, not something we do so lightly, right? one of the 10 commandments, thou shalt not take God's name in vain. So to say a blessing, to say a bracha, is not such a simple, easy answer. We don't say brachot unless we actually are able to, justify the recitation of God's name. So comes along Rabbi Maimon in the moment and says, hey, I want us to say Shechianu, and I'm going to lead by example. And he screams out Shechianu. Now, Rabbi Maimon came under a little bit of fire because are you so sure that you're allowed to do that? So take a look what he wrote in one line. And there's a picture of him. This is a picture of Rabbi Yehuda Leib Maimon. Let's take a look here on this screen number 3. Here we go. What does the Rabbi Maimon write? He writes, Binogea l'shehechianu, regarding shehechianu. Yadua, it is known. Bracha shiachol kol ish, any person. Levarech, to bless b'sha'asha simcha b'me'ono uvil vavo. That's a key word, in his heart. V'zatalui legamre, it is completely dependent. B'da'ato shel adam, on the mindset of that person. So as we heard in the video, when Ben Gurion read Megillat HaAtzmaut, he was so overtaken with joy and emotion, and based on his interpretation of this Shechianu, he said, how could I not respond? By saying, and Shechianu is the kind of bracha, it's the kind of blessing, which is based on the personal joy, and it's unique from person to person. Therefore, you can recite Shechianu when you want to. And I was standing at the precipice of history. My friend David Ben Gurion just read the perhaps most influential document in contemporary Jewish history. How could I respond with anything else other than saying Shechianu v'kimanu v'gianu lazman hazeh? And that's what he writes. There's a picture of Maimon shortly around that time. So, who was Rabbi Yehuda Maimon? And again, it was Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda. His actual name was Rabbi Yehuda Leib Fishman. Who was he, and what was his background? He was a Kohen. He was known also as Rabbi Yehuda Kohen Maimon. He died in 1962, and he was one of the rabbinic leaders of the religious Zionist movement. He was actually a rabbi in Moldova. His smicha was from Rabbi Chil Michal Epstein, you may know as the author of the Aruch HaShulchan. He was a very, very significant rabbi. And he was an activist. And the bona fides he has an activist is, if you know that in the Russian Empire, if you were arrested by the Russian authorities for Zionist activity, he was really, a strong Zionist leader. He got to Eretz Yisrael, was able to get to Eretz Yisrael in 1913. In 1913, he was able to get there. Now, who was in charge of Israel in 1913? It was then part of the Ottoman Empire. So things were not so simple. And World War I, it was so hard that he was, especially the rumblings he was doing, he was booted out of Israel. He was expelled from Israel before there was an Israel. He was expelled. And he made his way to the United States and was one of the founders of a group you may have heard of called Mizrahi. So he was very, very important. He is the founder of a group. He was on the board of the Jewish Agency. He established a couple of real visionary. He established something called the Chief Rabbinate of Israel. The idea of having a Chief Rabbi of Israel was partially his brainchild, and one of the inaugural holders was a good friend of him, Rabbi Cook. He was such a close connected Rabbi Cook. He founded a publishing house, and this is what was one of the things he's most known for, called Mossad HaRav Kook. Mossad HaRav Kook is a publishing house, a very prominent publishing house of many important Jewish books, founded by Rav Maimon. If you remember, there is a British police station in Israel. Now it's a tank museum called Latrun, Latrun. When he went back to Israel, the British imprisoned him in Latrun. And listen to what happened. He was arrested on Shabbat. He says, I'm not getting into a car on Shabbat. No problem. I'll walk. He volunteered to walk to be arrested. And they said no, and they threw him into a car anyway. But he was one of the drafters and the signatories of the Israeli directory, the Megillat Atzmut, the Israeli Declaration of Independence, which we briefly mentioned about some of the arguments that they had. Was it allowed to be called? Should they mention God? Should they not mention God? And he was one of the, together with Zarek Farhaptik, one of the builders, the compromise that they would say, with faith in the Rock of Israel, where the religious felt, who's the Rock of Israel? God. The non-religious like, oh, sure, we have no problem because we're the Rock of Israel. So that was, he was the first, what's called Sar Hadatot, Minister of Religions. It was a ministerial position in the government of Israel, and he was the Sar Hadatot. And what's fascinating was that he as the Sar Hadatot, he was one of the strong builders of the Department of Religious Affairs. And do you know who was one of the chief officers and officials in the Department of Religious Affairs in the state of Israel not too long ago? Rabbi Simon Dolgan. The Misrad Hadatot, when he moved to Israel, ended up being a big mover and shaker in that Israeli religion, in the Israeli government department of the Department of Religion. So it's sort of a Beth Jacob connection to Misrad Hadatot that was inaugurally held by Rabbi Maimon. Again, so he was an Ashkenazi Jew. He actually signed his name Fishman most of the time, but he was known as Maimon, and he strongly felt that it was absolutely appropriate, and he led by example in the reading of the Declaration of Independence of Israel, strongly appropriate to have a recitation of Shechianu. And he did it. So that's the first opinion I want to share. The next was the first chief rabbi of Israel. And let's see if we can get a picture of him. Let's see here. Let's see, here we go. One of the first Sephardic chief rabbis of Israel was named Rabbi Uziel. Rabbi Uziel, hopefully you can see him. Let me just make sure you can. Share screen 3. Rabbi Uziel. Now, Rabbi Ben Sion Chai Uziel was the chief rabbi of Israel, and he wrote a letter in 1949. In 1949, he wrote this letter, and he wrote this letter in response to a rabbi in Tzfat. Rabbi in Tzfat, Rabbi Beirish Zaltz, who I don't know much about. But Rabbi Uziel, in 1948, followed Rabbi Maimon. And he said, when you have a yearly celebration of Yom HaAtzmaut, we're not talking about Hallel right now, a yearly celebration of Yom HaAtzmaut, you are meant to have a recitation of Shechianu as part of the celebration. When you celebrate Atzmaut, part of the event, part of the celebration should be Shechianu. Now, Rabbi Zaltz, who was a rabbi in Tzfat, wrote him a letter and says, not so fast. Right? By the way, Rabbi Uziel actually at that time said you should say Hallel without a bracha. Fascinating. But we'll leave the Hallel discussion aside. Rabbi Zaltz said, one second. I'll accept that Shechianu is appropriate when there is joy and euphoria, no problem. And I'll accept that this was a euphoric and joyous moment, unparalleled in modern Jewish history. Absolutely, I'll accept that, says Rabbi Zaltz in this letter to the chief rabbi. However, there is a Gemara, and Tosfot elaborates on this, about a story of a Brit Milah. And Tosfot, when discussing Brit Milah, says, if you'll note, at the ceremony, open up a Siddur, you'll see, at the ceremony of a Brit Milah, you do not recite Shechianu. You do not recite Shechianu. Why don't you recite Shechianu? So Tosfot has a very novel and powerful idea. Tosfot says, do you know when you say Shechianu? When the event is what he's called monolithic, meaning there is one unique aspect, one harmonious feeling. So a yontif is a yom tov, right? It's a day of joy, a good day, a day of celebration. So you should say Shechianu. A bris milah, a day of celebration. You're exciting. It's a party. You're going to have bagels in a few minutes. All this great stuff. However, a bris milah also has pain. The baby's in pain. And because of the mix of joy, but also difficulty and hardship, you don't say Shechianu. So comes along Rabbi Zaltz and says, you know what? I'll accept and agree that the establishment of the state of Israel is, again, groundbreaking, unique, really cataclysmic in all of Jewish history in a way that it's changed the entire narrative. Atchalta de Geula. It's the most joyous event we could ever have imagined, but we ain't done yet. Especially at the time, think about 1949, there's a lot of fighting left to do, right? And what was the status of Yerushalayim? Right? And, 49 to the 67, up until 67, maybe they were changing in 67, but we did not have the type of quiet and peace and tranquility. We had a declaration. We had a lot of more wars to fight. And therefore, Rabbi Zaltz said, maybe you shouldn't say Shechianu because there's more, it's an incomplete celebration. And therefore, it does not yet warrant the recitation of Shechianu. So that's what he wrote to Rabbi Uziel, who had advocated. So this is Rabbi Uziel's response. All right, there's a picture, Rabbi Ben Zion Chai Uziel, one of the first chief rabbis of Israel, the Sephardi chief rabbi of Israel at the time. This is Rabbi Ben Zion Uziel, and again, he writes this in 1949. In 1949, he writes, Shapir Sharilon. Shapir means it is absolutely correct for us, Litakein brachazot, to enact the recitation of this blessing. B'shem u'malchut, using God's name. Absolutely. Shekol toshavei Eretz Yisrael, that all of the inhabitants of the land of the land of Israel, nimletu mishiabud zeh, shukaruch, who have been able to escape this subservience, both that was causing the death of individuals and the entire community. She'ashulton hazar, the British mandate, shehifkir et damenu, that made our blood like hefker. The British mandate was, from the perspective of Rabbi Uziel, one of the most horrific things that had happened to the Jewish people. Hifkir et damenu. V'gam radaf ba'onshei mavet kol anoshay neshek. Anyone who was carrying a weapon was threatened with a death penalty. So we couldn't even protect ourselves. We couldn't even have any protection for ourselves. Had it not for this declaration of a country that unified us to one, to be one nation, one group, he's quoting from Megillat Esther, to stand up for ourselves. Because, hey, that is going to bring on the wars of all of the nations around us, in addition to our oppressors here in the land. Absolutely must we say Shechianu. So Rabbi Uziel also felt Shechianu was appropriate. However, he said there is a major difference between the story of the Brit Milah you rabbis also raised and the creation of the state of Israel, right? The establishment of the state is separate and distinct from the difficulty that we're going to face in the future, right? As opposed to the Bris Milah. The Bris Milah that we're celebrating we're celebrating the covenant, and in that same act, there's pain. So we say, okay, no Shechianu. Regarding the establishment of the state of Israel, there's a lot of different things going on. The establishment of the state itself is fundamentally good, full stop. Will there be additional aspects of our life experience that will have pain? True, of course, it's going to be a tough road. But when the event is universally and exclusively positive, and look what it's done, it's allowed us to end the chapter in our history where our blood was hefker, and now we can stand up for ourselves. Absolutely, you should say Shechianu. Rav Uziel, also like Rabbi Maimon, felt the recitation of Shechianu was this blessing of praise that expressed this great joy. Interestingly, Rabbi Uziel and Rabbi Maimon come from different perspectives. Rabbi Uziel was saying, when do you say, Rabbi Maimon, in the first one, when do you say Shechianu? You say Shechianu when you personally have a feeling of exhilaration. Rabbi Uziel, the second opinion, didn't talk about my personal feelings. It more and instead dealt with my sense of connection to the broader community. On a communal celebration, that's when Shechianu is warranted. On a personal celebration, that Rabbi Uziel did not delve into. So that was the feeling Rabbi Uziel. So again, just to recap, we've had two different opinions about Shechianu on the establishment of the state of Israel. We have Rabbi Maimon, who said you should do it, and as we showed in the video, famously did it himself when he announced, following the announcement of the establishment of the state. And his explanation was, it's because of our personal exhilaration. And the bracha of Shechianu is connected to a personal sense of exhilaration. Rabbi Maimon said, I agree, you should say Shechianu. And the reason to do it, though, is not exactly the approach that Rabbi Maimon had. The approach would be, the second approach is when you have a communal celebration. So Rabbi Maimon talked about our personal sense. Rabbi Uziel talked purely on a communal level. Okay? So what an interesting tweak in history was that this response, this letter was a personal letter that was only made public. This letter of Rabbi Uziel, the chief rabbi, was only made public in 1961, a full decade, more than a decade later. He wrote it in 1949, and it became public in 1961. Now, think about the 10 plus years of the intervening, right? It's not yet 67. Israel is at a precarious, in the middle of a very precarious decade. And this debate has grown. So Rabbi Maimon himself, the one who originally said Shechianu, asked for additional clarification. Because, again, he hadn't heard yet from Rabbi Uziel. So Rabbi Maimon himself wrote to a rabbi by the name of Rabbi Meshulam Roth. This is Rabbi Meshulam Roth. Rabbi Meshulam Roth right here, or Rata, because Reish Aleph Tet Hey. Meshulam Roth lived from 1875 till 1962. And in 1952, right, 3 years after the original letter, but it wasn't public yet. Rabbi Roth responded to Rabbi Maimon's request for clarification, saying, all right, should we recite Shechianu on the establishment of the state of Israel? Now, who was Rabbi Meshulam Roth? Rabbi Meshulam Roth was a Ukrainian rabbi who moved to Israel in 1944. Now, let me just see if I can let's see if I get it here. Let me see if I can find more. Rabbi Meshulam Roth was a fascinating figure because he lived very much in the non-Zionist world. He was not originally brought up in the Zionist world. Spent much of his early career in Eastern Europe, and was known as a great shakdan. A shakdan is a person who has tremendous stamina. Nobody's going to like this, but when he interviewed for his first rabbinic position, he had a prova. So he went to the what happened when you had a prova, when you have an interview for your rabbinic position. This was in a town called Korostikiv, and he was invited to give the drasha. Guess how long his drasha was? 6 hours. Can you imagine? 6 hour long drasha. And he got the job. That's the craziest thing. He only had one source sheet at Tanakh. That was his only source sheet. And he gave a drasha for 6 hours holding a Tanakh. But he came to the position and the realization that the future of the Jewish people requires us to build the state of Israel, to build the land, and he became a very strong Mizrahi Zionist, and he established and was considered a very, very prominent rabbinic figure in Israel. So he dealt with this, and they asked him in 1952, clarify for us. And again, this is Rabbi Maimon who took a stand. Is it appropriate to say Shechianu on Yom HaAtzmaut? Right? What should that be part of the ceremony? Interestingly, now that doesn't seem much of a debate nowadays. Much of the debate we think about is regarding Halal. But at the time, they really talked a lot about Shechianu. All right, so let's take a look at what Rabbi Meshulam Roth wrote. Okay. Now, Rabbi Meshulam Roth does not think about this in terms of personal or national joy. He says, no, we need to look at this, right? Because both Rabbi Maimon and Rabbi Uziel, Rabbi Maimon was like, if there's something, an event that happens that is really euphoric to you, say Shechianu. Rabbi Uziel said, if there's an event that happens that is really euphoric to the whole community, say Shechianu. Rabbi Maimon, Rabbi Roth, Rabbi Shmuel Rosh, he said, no, let's analyze it from, again, a different perspective. I'm so sorry. This seems to keep happening. I apologize. Sorry about that. I'm not sure why all of those additional sounds came in. Hopefully you didn't hear them, but they were going in the background here. Rabbi Meshulam Roth took this from, again, a totally different perspective. And again, let me just try and show that again. Here we go. So Rabbi Meshulam Roth said, really, the approach you should take is to try and understand, does Yom Ha'atzmaut transform into a holiday? What should trigger Shechianu? What should trigger Shechianu is, do we treat Yom Ha'atzmaut as a new holiday that we're introducing into the Jewish calendar, right? And so, for example, we have Hanukkah, Purim, right? Where the Jewish community had an event that was very important, and they decided we're going to transform it into a holiday. So assume that instead of just talking about your personal joy about a miracle, or your communal joy about a miracle, really, it should be a question of what is the process by which we institute new holidays. And that's going to be what impacts whether or not you say Shechianu. By the way, we don't say Shechianu on every single holiday, right? The Gemara, after a long debate, says that we do say Shechianu on most holidays, like Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. We say Shechianu on Hanukkah when we light the candles the first night. We say Shechianu on Purim when we read the Megillah. But what is the background of, he says, that's going to be your answer. You want to know whether or not you say Shechianu, the answer is going to be when you create a new approach. And so his final conclusion is the following. What comes, and let me see if I can, hopefully I'm sharing Rabbi Meshulam Roth right here. What comes out in terms of law on this matter? On a day that there's a miracle occurred to the entire nation of Israel, from death to life, and from subjugation to freedom. And it's such a festive day that is established like Yom Ha'atzmaut, according to the Brit Chadash, you should not recite Shechianu. And according to the Meiri, we do. So what he does is he says, okay, let's look at the sources. There's the Brit Chadash, and then there's the Meiri, the Mishnah Berurah, Yaakov Emden, all these other opinions that say when you establish a new holiday, you do say Shechianu. And the best time to say it would be right before Hallel, because even other opinions. So the key here is that what I want to bring out from Rabbi Roth is that the question is the wrong question that we were raising before, right? Rabbi Maimon and Rabbi Uziel were raising the question, does personal happiness or communal happiness trigger Shechianu? Rabbi Roth was like, no, that's not the right question. Shechianu is a technical obligation on a holiday. Do you create a holiday or not? And he came to the conclusion, you know what? Yom Ha'atzmaut is so meaningful and so powerful that yes, we should be creating a holiday a la Purim and Hanukkah. Major events in Jewish history that change the course of who and what we are, and therefore they deserve a holiday. And now he says, okay, when you have a holiday, do you say Shechianu or not? Okay, well, there's opinions on this side, opinions on that side, and you know what? I think you should. So he also came to the conclusion that you should say Shechianu on Yom Ha'atzmaut because the nature of what the holiday is necessitates it. Now, just to recap, there's many more, but we're just going to focus on 4. The first opinion was Rabbi Maimon, who, as we heard, said Shechianu himself. The second opinion was Rabbi Uziel, who said Rabbi Maimon, I don't agree with you. It shouldn't be triggered just by personal joy. But since there was a communal joy, therefore we should say Shechianu. Rabbi Roth said, you both are wrong. That's not what triggers Shechianu. A new holiday is what triggers Shechianu. And I think that Yom HaTzmaut is a big enough deal that it should be a new holiday. And therefore, the majority of the opinions say when you have a new holiday, you should say Shechianu. Now I want to get to the fourth opinion, and that is one of Maxine's favorites, Rabbi Goren. Now this is a picture of Rabbi Goren that is perhaps one of the most famous. It's not generally the way he looked, but it was from his role when he was the chief rabbi of Tzahal. And as the chief rabbi of Tzahal, he insisted during the liberation of Jerusalem to be on the front lines. Even as not a combat soldier, you see he's not in the age of most of the combat soldiers, but he insisted. So where he got to that point of Har HaBayit, he was able to blow the shofar. And that's that famous picture of him blowing the shofar at the liberation of Yerushalayim, surrounded by the Tzamchanim, surrounded by the Israeli paratroopers. And he wrote a much longer than what I'm going to quote here. But he wrote in 1956. Remember, only in 1961 did the chief rabbi, Rabbi Uziel's response come out. But 1956, he wrote a response. So he wrote about this. He, by the way, interestingly, did not originally publish it as a book. He wrote it as a letter to the editor of the modern Zionist newspaper called Hatzofeh. And he wrote it as a letter that they published from Rabbi Goren. And he wrote that, and by the way, one of the things I didn't mention is that there were many, many rabbis who had totally different approaches to everything we've said, who says that you shouldn't say Shechianu for all sorts of other reasons. Most of them centered around the concept of what's called Chidush Halacha, which is that it's a very delicate and perhaps slippery process to innovate and bring in a new holiday or a new halacha or necessitate a bracha. As we mentioned at the very beginning, saying a bracha is not a benign behavior, right? You're saying God's name, and we have one of the 10 commandments not to say God's name in vain. So it's not so simple that you can do it, but we've quoted here 3 major opinions that you could, and many, many other opinions on all sides of the issue. Rabbi Goren, though, wrote, and he took it to the next level. He said that we have to take Rabbi Roth's idea to the next level. Rabbi Roth's suggestion is when you have a new holiday, the majority of the opinions say you should say Shechianu. Rabbi Goren said, I'm going to take that to the next level. And he argued that Yom HaTzmaut isn't just a commemoration. It is a day that has new spiritual significance. And what genders Shechianu is having a holiday plus this new spiritual significance. Why do we say Shechianu on Hanukkah and Purim? Because there's a new mitzvah, reading the Megillah, lighting the Hanukkah candles. There's a new spiritual element that is infused into the Jewish world. A new mitzvah, right? Of Hanukkah, of Megillah. And therefore he argued that Yom HaTzmaut has innate spiritual sanctity, and that you now basically have a new mitzvah. What do you mean a new mitzvah? It says when you now have access to so much more of Eretz Yisrael and the ability to do all the mitzvot tatzluyot ba'aretz, the mitzvot that are agricultural or the mitzvot that are unique to Eretz Yisrael. So you now essentially are commemorating, it's like a Shechianu on all the mitzvos that you can now do as the Jewish people who are free in the land of Israel. And therefore, look at the language he uses. Amirat birchat Shechianu b'shem u'malchut b'yom ha'atzmaut. Recitation of Shechianu with God's name on Yom HaTzmaut. Now, l'chol mi shemargish b'nafsho b'yom zeh simcha amitit shemakorot halacha mechayvim Yom Tov. So he brings up all these pictures together. He says, listen to halachic sources obligate the recitation of Shechianu with the Shem Malchut, because all people feel the joy in the soul, the joy of a festival. So he was politically correct, and he says, I'm not going to fault anybody for not saying Shechianu, but if you truly feel the joy of this day. So he kind of mixes some of the opinions. He mixes Rabbi Maimon's opinion, who says, I'm just overwhelmed by joy. He mixes Rabbi Roth's opinion, says that you've transformed this into a holiday. And he says, now when you transform the holiday and it has this extra spiritual component, then indeed you are required to say Shechianu. Now it's interesting, if you look at a bunch of the contemporary Sidurim, many of them who have Hallel on Yom Ha'atzmaut and Hallel with a bracha, which by the way, Rabbi Uziel said not to say. Rabbi Uziel felt that you should say Hallel Yom Ha'atzmaut. And again, he wrote this in 1949, but it was only published in 1961. But he said you should say a bracha of Shechianu, but not say Hallel with a bracha. You should say Hallel without a bracha. Fascinating. Now, I'm not going to get into any halacha l'maaseh. Many contemporary Sidurim, I don't believe the Koran, I believe, does. Many contemporary Sidurim do not necessarily include Shechianu as part of Yom Ha'atzmaut liturgy. Some do. And even you find even certain Sidurim that will have Hallel with a bracha might not necessarily have Shechianu. It's an interesting debate, leaving aside. What I want to do, though, is now bring this to the question we started with at the beginning, which is, does one recite Shechianu on the coronavirus vaccine? Now, we brought four approaches. The first and the fourth approach might say you should, right? For sure, Rabbi Maimon, who says that if you personally, right, and listen to the words he used. Let's see if I'm still sharing here. Yeah. Rabbi Maimon's words were, well known, a bracha that any person can recite at the time where there is joy in their domain and in their hearts. Entirely dependent on the mindset of that person. So, let's talk about two scenarios. Either, and again, my parents are on, I saw pictures receiving the vaccine, very, very exciting. And or let's say a medical, frontline medical worker who's been on the front lines of, and I don't know if you saw some of that video, it was a great video in Israel that was shown around the world, you should look for it, of the staff of a medical center in Israel dancing, with music and dancing at the celebration of the new vaccine. And so for Rabbi Maimon, absolutely, right? Frankly, I would say Shechianu because my parents are going to be healthier and safer because of this. So, there could be absolutely the argument to say Shechianu on the receiving of a COVID vaccine. The only Rabbi Zaltz might say, yeah, but maybe it's similar to a bris because it hurts, they give you a pinch. So, maybe since it also is like a bris is exciting and it brings you into the covenant of the Jewish people, but there's pain. So, Rabbi Zaltz might say that would suggest that you shouldn't say Shechianu. Rabbi Uziel's approach had to do with whether or not this is an event that is communally cataclysmic. And you might say, okay, well, maybe either the first person or the last person to take the vaccine would engender everybody saying, would engender Shechianu. But, somebody in the middle getting the vaccine, it's not yet a communal celebration, like the way that the events of the establishment in the state of Israel was. And therefore, if it's, Rabbi Maimon folds personal, you probably would. Rabbi Uziel, I would say probably not. Rabbi Roth probably also would say you should not say Shechianu on the receiving of the COVID vaccine if we assume this parallel is correct, which is, again, I'm not making any of these arguments, lahalacha. But Rabbi Maimon, Rabbi Shalom Roth, Rabbi Roth, I would say was probably not. Because Roth says Shechianu isn't connected to an event. as much as connected to a new holiday. And if perhaps we establish a holiday on the inauguration of the COVID vaccine, and we celebrate it every year, which may happen, what do I know, then you might indeed have Shechianu in there, and I would say that Rabbi Gorin might concur. All of this comes in a non-halachic sense. I would say, ask your local Orthodox rabbi what the appropriate thing to do would be. It seems that Rabbi Maimon would be a good source for Shechianu, and I've heard of many people. I know I was talking to Rabbi Weiner, who has been working. Rabbi Weiner is the chaplain of our local hospital, and he's been working, front line in COVID units. And he said when he got the vaccine, everybody was crying, and everybody, and many people said Shechianu with great emotion, similar to Rabbi Maimon that we played at the very beginning. Because of what they had gone through and what this means for the future, just like those folks in the Israeli hospital dancing. Again, not giving any psak here whatsoever. It's just interesting to compare this discussion on a technical level to the different, to an interesting discussion in the Zionist community that has happened in the past. So with that, I wish everybody a wonderful, wonderful day and a great Shabbat. As I mentioned, we're going to be off for 2 weeks. We're not going to have a class next Thursday at the December 31st, and the Thursday after that is exciting because it's coming up on Rabbi Posy's bar mitzvah. So I'm going to take a personal day on 2 weeks from today. So wish everybody again all of the best on their extended holiday weekend. And look forward to being able to share many smachot. Hopefully we'll all get vaccinated and to be able to be safe together.
I have a question, Rabbi.
Yes.
This is the first time I've heard this discussion about, as you presented it so beautifully, do I have to make a Shechianu now?
So as a personal psak, my sense is that the poskim generally have not been recommending Shechianu. I would say if you feel like Rabbi Maimon suggested, as they say, yesh al min lismoch, to recite a Shechianu in the depending on sort of your mindset in the COVID vaccine. My sense is that the consensus is that people generally are not reciting Shechianu on the vaccine for some of the reasons that we mentioned, specifically, especially the comparison to the Bristol.
No, but I was asking, do I make a Shechianu having heard this year for the first time?
No requirement.
Oh, okay, thank you.
Okay.